Welcome everyone. I'm conscious we might have a few people joining later on, but as it's 5 past, we thought we might start. My name is Vasilios Karagianopoulos. I'm a reader in cybercrime and cybersecurity at the University of Portsmouth. And you've joined us today for our webinar for our ORPHEUS project, which is funded by Interreg 2Cs. And it involves partners from France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, as well as the UK. ORPHEUS is a 3.5-year project, which has maybe been extended a bit in relation to COVID as well. And the focus is on dealing with violent extremism and creating safe spaces for young people and figuring out how to create more resilience to attempts to groom them for political extremism and radicalization. So today's webinar focuses on the extreme right on social media, and it's titled The Extreme Right on Social Media, the Lure of Propaganda, from Perfect Puppies to Sensationalist Stories. And it relates to one of the aspects of the project that we're very keen on, and this relates essentially to our cyber awareness training and our critical online thinking training. We feel that providing this knowledge to young people will enable them to become more conscious of political discussions out there and political information and propaganda, and will create more resilience in terms of attempts to groom them to join certain political groups that would then steer them towards propaganda. I apologize, my cat wants to get in the picture as well. So we're very fortunate to have Dr. Lella Nouri with us today. And we're unlucky that Professor Nuria Lorenzo-Dus has not been able to make it due to a health issue. I will introduce Lella now. So she is a senior lecturer of criminology and program director of the MA in cybercrime and terrorism at Swansea University. She specializes in radical right and extremist use of the internet and is the co-director of the Online Radical Right Research International Network, which is part of Swansea University's Cyber Threats Intelligence Center. Her most recent research has explored the discourse of the US alt-right online, the development of virtual communities by UK extremist groups, and the visual strategies of the UK far-right, as well as hosting numerous events on these topics, including a recent Vox poll workshop of academic experts and practitioner stakeholders. Lella's work also informs policy, which is something we want to do as well with the ORPHEUS project. So Lella will appreciate your input and help. For example, she is an active member of the Academic Practitioner Network for the UK Government's Commission for Countering Extremism and a partner of the Christchurch Call. In 2017-18, Lella held a visiting scholar position at the University of California, Santa Barbara on a Fulbright Cybersecurity Award. Earlier work includes projects focusing on understandings and construction of cyber terrorism, as well as on the UK prevent strategies, understanding of the role of the internet. Thank you for coming today, Lella. We're looking forward to your presentation very much. And we're very fortunate to have you here. Thank you to everyone joining us from various different countries and to all the partners who have joined us. And I hope we can enjoy the talk. If you have any questions, please either put them in the chat and I will personally ask at the end of the talk, or we will have a Q&A session as we usually do at the end of our webinars, and you can then ask your questions after the talk by unmuting and asking the question. Whatever you prefer, we wanted to give people both options, and if you prefer to write it down, I will ask it for you, so that's no problem at all. Lella, over to you. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Vas, for that very kind introduction, and thank you very much to everybody involved in the ORPHEUS project. We were very grateful to receive this invitation, and we hope that everybody here today finds this talk interesting. My apologies on behalf of my colleague, Professor Nuria Lorenzo-Dus, but of course her aspects of the presentation are integrated into what I will discuss today. So as Vas already explained, I'm from Swansea University and I'm part of the Cyber Threats Research Centre, and my research concentrates around the far right, the extreme right, and in particular their use of online spaces. And the work that I'm going to present to you today is a number of different projects that I have been embarked on with a number of different colleagues over the last couple of years, and hopefully gives a little bit of an insight into some of the findings that we have from very much data-driven projects in relation to how, what and why and the effect of the far right and the extreme right online. Just before I start, I want to also just give credit to the fact that many of these projects were funded by Swansea University itself, also the Fulbright Commission, as Vas mentioned, and the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism, which is part of ORPHEUS. So today, my key discussion is going to be around two studies which we've conducted over the last couple of years, based around language online and then also on visual imagery online as well. And we're going to look at how the strategies of extreme right groups have changed and tend to change when they move from a mainstream social media platform to more fringe sites. And our case study in this case is of Britain First, which some of you may be aware of, and I'll give a few more details about later. And then I'm going to end just by talking a little bit about some of the policy implications for all of this, as well as what this means in terms of building societal resilience in this area. So we often hear the terms bandied about, such as far right or extreme right, and I guess the group that I'm going to focus on today, Britain First, is very much encapsulated by the term far right. And as Vas kindly pointed out, my research specialises on the radical right very generally, and I like to use that broad umbrella because we're not talking about a heterogeneous group within this field. We're talking about groups, some of which go all the way into that extreme ideology and may condone or conduct violence, and then those more in the far right area. And most studies within terrorism research and extremism more generally does tend to focus on that extreme right, but I think that the far right are just as important in this area for a number of different reasons. Firstly, being that if we think about the UK government's counter-terrorism strategy, this focuses on preventative measures, so a pre-criminal stage. And arguably, those that are involved with the extreme right are already involved or likely to be involved in violence. But if we're looking to prevent someone becoming involved in extremism, then we need to think about what is it that is introducing someone to that kind of ideology, and how is it that someone engages in extremist activity, which is why I think those far right groups that don't necessarily engage in criminal activity, but do advocate for some quite hateful ideology are so important. Far right groups tend to be the spaces for some extreme right recruitment. And organizations associated with the far right, can be seen to be a part of some of this pathway. What I like to refer to these groups are, and I've got some examples there on the screen, are gateway organizations. And gateway organizations refer to those groups who are not directly involved necessarily in the pursuit of violence, but are seen to facilitate pathways to violent extremism. And this is based on an understanding of the three performative functions of gateway organizations. And this was based on a study that was put forward by King's College in 2008. And these three performative functions were pointed at as indoctrination, socialization, and subversion. So first, in terms of indoctrination, gateway organizations are seen to share the same ideological ideas to those of violent extremist groups, but do not themselves act upon them. Second, socialization refers to the process by which gateway organisations introduce individuals into that radical milieu in which it becomes easy to establish social networks with those who are more extreme. Third, and finally, is subversion. Gateway organisations are seen to embrace values which are incompatible with the current state of play. Gateway organisations, therefore, without tarnishing too much, are thus becoming the breeding ground for more extremism. Gateway organisations, in the case of the radical right, are becoming more and more important, and we've seen that especially, in recent times. Yet most scholars, politicians, and even the media tend to focus on those more extreme far-right groups which are engaged in physical violence. Policymakers have long discussed the vulnerability pinch points for extremist messages, such as within prisons, schools, and workplaces. Social media, for me, represents the same pinch points. So just like I talk about gateway organisations, I'm also going to talk today about gateway platforms. So before the removal of Britain First from Facebook, which is the group that I'm going to focus on today, most people that I know had seen a Britain First post or knew someone who followed them, and as such had some of their messages coming up on their newsfeed. Britain First ideology was relatively tame at the time that they were on Facebook, but it did have some harmful components, as we'll discuss later. And so in this sense, it became an everyday occurrence, something that people had become quite accustomed to on Facebook. It normalized this type of rhetoric. And Britain First is just one of many groups that will come and go. And in a sense, the group themselves isn't that important. What is, however, is why these groups gain such unprecedented popularity on social media. And perhaps more importantly, how they're able to permeate their ideas throughout society, whether people agree with them or not. So it's time, I think, that we paid more attention both to these groups, but also to the gateway platforms. And the case study of Britain First, I think, that I'm going to talk about today really highlights the importance of online activity. So let's get to this case study. So most of you will have heard of Britain First, or maybe know a little bit about them. But just to give a little bit of context for those who don't, Britain First was first formed by Jim Dawson, a former member of the British National Party, in 2011. And it was a product really of the decline of the English Defence League. Britain First describes itself as a patriotic political party and street movement that opposes and fights the many injustices that are routinely inflicted on the British people. The group's leaders state that they're not a racist party. They claim that many ethnic minorities are among their supporters, but they claim that they aim to protect British and Christian morality and to preserve the ancestral, ethnic and cultural heritage of the UK while supporting the indigenous British people as a demographic majority. They have campaigned against Islamism and the spread of militant Islam in the UK. And on their Facebook page, now removed, Britain First leaders claimed not to be against individual Muslims, but specifically against the ideological doctrine and religion of Islam itself. A couple of months before Britain First was removed from Facebook, they had reached over 1.8 million followers and had over 2 million likes on Facebook, making it, according to Hope Not Hate, the second most liked Facebook page within the politics and society category in the UK, only being trumped by the royal family. Less than 3 months later, two key Britain First leaders, Paul Golding and Jada Franson, created Gab profiles, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But Gab is a platform which many public figures associated with the radical right, including Tommy Robinson, Paul Joseph Watson, and Emilio Yiannopoulos, have been known to be users of and still are. And this quote that you've got there on your screen is a quote directly taken from their Facebook page, as it was. If we look a little bit further down after the dots, they said that we want our people to come first before foreigners, asylum seekers or migrants, and we're overtly proud of this stance. We want British jobs for British workers, and we'll make sure that our workers come first. So you can really start to see what their ideology is all about here. They also have had a number of policies, which included the deportation of illegal immigrants, the halting of immigration full stop and the rejection of asylum seekers. They wanted to end all foreign aid spending, restore capital punishment. And again, they reiterate within their sort of policy guidelines on their website and on their Facebook page at the time that they're not a racist party, that they campaign against Islamism, and that Muslims are the only community unable to integrate into British society. On the streets, so if we take step away for 1 second from the online environment, they do engage and have engaged in a lot of activity, mainly around protests and campaigning, but also in terms of what they refer to as Christian patrol, where they would dress as they are on the screen, carrying crosses, wearing paramilitary type outfits, often with Land Rovers in tow, and go around mosques handing out leaflets about Islam not being integratable into British society, etc. Excuse me. Online, they've managed to maintain a very strong presence. So before they got removed from Facebook, they had a number of regional pages as well as an official Britain First page, of which our data is drawn from. And as I mentioned earlier, they were very popular on Facebook. 1.8 million followers and 2 million likes. And if we look at it across the mainstream parties that we have here in the UK, you can see the real difference in terms of their popularity on that social media site compared to, say, the Conservatives, Labour, UKIP, etc. Which tells us something already, I think, about what this group was and it continues actually to do still right within these spaces. You'll have to excuse me, I have a little bit of a cold. So, as I alluded to already, on the 14th of March 2018, Facebook banned Britain First from its platform, reasoning that they had repeatedly posted content designed to incite animosity and hatred against minority groups. And this came, coincidentally, just a week after Britain First leaders Paul Golding and Jada Franson were collectively convicted of 4 counts of hate crime and jailed for a combination of 54 weeks. Their convictions related to the posting of videos onto their Facebook pages where they filmed themselves abusing innocent members of the public during a gang rape trial for what the trial judge described as their own political ends. And their the removal of Britain First from Facebook sparked debate about the content of the group's Facebook page and its posts, with a lot of high-profile figures speaking out about it, including the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, who described the group as a vile and hate-fueled group whose sole purpose is to sow division. So, where did they go when they left Facebook? Well, some of the key figures had already created Gab profiles before their ban, and around the same time they were banned from Twitter in December 2017. But they didn't create an official Britain First Gab page until May 2018, which was subsequent to their removal from Facebook. And in a little over a year, both leaders gained 14,000 to 15,000 followers each. And since they created the official Britain First page in May 2018, they've attracted just over 11,000 followers. So quite a difference in terms of reach compared to what they had on Facebook, which I'll go back to a little bit later. So that gives a sort of short introduction to Britain First and what they're all about. And what I'm going to talk to you today about now is 2 interrelated case studies that we've undertaken research within about Britain First. The first one is a language study, which looked at their language across Twitter and Facebook. And the second, more of a visual strategy study looking at how their visual strategy changed from Facebook to Gab. So the purpose of this first study, which I'm going to talk about, which is the language study, was to look at the far right's use of social media, and we used Facebook as our primary example. And what we did here is we did a comparative study of Britain First and Reclaim Australia, which are a very similar group within the Australian context. And we wanted to do a language analysis, and this was both quantitative and qualitative, to see what kind of language they were using and how this was translated into likes and shares and that kind of thing. And the purpose of this in terms of policy was for intelligence gathering and alternative narrative development. And this was actually done in conjunction with conversations with the Welsh Counter-Terrorism Unit and their priorities at the time. So the data we used comprised of all the posts and tweets posted by Britain First and Reclaim Australia and to the Britain First and Reclaim Australia Facebook and Twitter accounts between the 31st of January 2017 and the 11th of April 2017. And this included data posted by those managing the Britain First accounts and those that have directly tweeted or posted at the Britain First pages. And as you can hopefully see from the table, a couple of immediate observations are possible on first glance of the data. Firstly, both of those groups favoured the use of Facebook over Twitter, which tells us something about usages of different platforms. And the data collected from Reclaim Australia, despite being over the same time period, is almost a third the size of the Britain First one, meaning that the Britain First account was much more active within this time frame. And this is why Britain First have been such a good example for us in terms of our studies of the far right, because they are just very active online and a really good example of a far right group, unfortunately, using these sites incredibly well. Now, if my colleague Nuria was here today, she'd be able to talk you through our methodology, which was a corpus-assisted discourse study, which is her area. But I've kept the slide here for those from a linguistic background or wanting to know a little bit more about our methodology. I won't go into too much detail, but basically we conducted CADS analysis via CQP web software. And this is software-enabled analysis of keywords to reveal really what a corpus or a group of words and data is all about. And then on top of that, we did a manual analysis of all of the examples within each keyword, which I'll talk about now. So the analysis of the top 500 keywords within that data set led to 10 manually qualitatively derived thematic domains that contained keywords related to each other by means of different features. Out of the top 500 keywords, 69 of them were categorized into 3 domain groups, as you can see there on your screen. And as the table shows, Reclaim Australia and Britain First regularly deployed the same thematic domains, which we have termed topical events and in-out groups. However, there were differences within these domains as well. So, for example, when compared with Britain First, Reclaim Australia made use of a distinctly aggressive verbal style, categorised by salient use of swearing and derogatory terms, whereas Britain First tended to step away from that a little bit, which really links into their strategy in terms of wanting to be seen, not as a political party as such, looking for elections, but seen to be, someone who would be seen to be lawful and abiding by the law and that kind of thing. So let's look at some examples. One of the key keywords for Britain First was grooming. And as the example illustrates on the screen there, the domain keyword was used in messages about a series of events that took place at the time in the English towns of Rochdale, Rotherham, and Telford, where it was reported that individuals identifying themselves as Muslim were allegedly involved in British female child rape grooming gangs. Now, the thematic domain of grooming constructed Muslims as a threat and danger to society. It vilified the Islamic community in the UK as paedophiles, arguably the worst possible deviants in society. A false, though emotionally very powerful, boundary-setting dichotomy was thereby created: us, British female children, and them, Muslim male gangs. And fear was further activated through the collectivization of the them group, that being the grooming gangs, and the portrayal of their behavior as a type of jihad. The example is also illustrative of the use of this thematic domain to criticize government inactivity and or negligence. It's not a surprise it took many, many years for politicians, local authorities, police to face. So this type of jihad is also tucked under the carpet. Britain First used the grooming thematic domain both to establish threats from those outside the boundaries of their community, in this case Muslim men, and to seek to legitimate their group by singly engaging in political discussion. So here, UK government, criminal justice. Britain First also referred to actions to be taken towards immigrants and Muslims. Britain First language was comprised of keywords that conveyed a law-observing stance, as illustrated in the second example there on your screen. Britain First used an ironic rhetorical question here: why no arrests? About the absence of lawful action towards illegal Muslim origin immigration in London. The answer was then provided: they can't do, followed by an explanation: a conspiracy between political authority, in this case, Mayor of London Sadiq Khan, of Muslim faith, and Muslims. Through examples such as these, thematic domain 6 sought to demonstrate Britain First political legitimacy as a group with its own political and criminal justice policies, and also to claim emotional power as a group with the means to expose existing systems as corrupt and on the side of the other group, in this case, the Muslims. The second example there on your screen refers to the keyword Antifa that came up within our keyword categorization, which is the name used to describe a number of anti-fascist movements in the UK. This keyword appeared in messages where Antifa groups were depicted negatively. A marked contrast was set between Antifa groups, who were represented as the real fascists and as violent, and Britain First, who were portrayed as neither. In this example, Britain First referred to a march that had taken place at the time, in which Antifa and Britain First members both participated, and which resulted in altercations between the two sides. So I've just given you a few examples of some of the thematic domains that came out of that language study, but on the basis of that study, what we did is we proposed an alternative model of extreme right social media-based communities online. And this was based on the imagined political communities idea. And what we said is that within the social media sphere, and you can read more about this in the article, first of all, threats and boundary establishment emerged as the overarching action deployed by extreme right groups on social media. Excuse me. Second, political legitimation and emotional power proved to be paramount to these groups in terms of helping them to both construct and promote their ideologies, or in other words, ideological square discursive structures. Three, horizontally framed by polarized structures, small stories, such as those in relation to grooming, we also saw it in relation to halal certification, were used to erode other imaginings. And as for erosion of other imaginings, this entailed stressing the urgency of joining the in-group by criticising the passivity of others, so in some of the examples, the UK government, who, unlike those in the Britain First community, did not want to change things. So that's case study one, which was the language study. And the second study that I'm going to talk to you about today was based around visuals. So within this, we looked at how far-right groups change their strategy depending on the social media platform. And this was specifically a visual analysis and had the same sort of emphasis, which was about intelligence gathering and policy recommendations to government and social media companies. And one of the key reasons why we embarked on this study was the importance of the use of online visuals by the extreme right. So unlike other internet users, the content posted by extremist groups in general, including those on the far right side of the spectrum, is distinctly visual. Excuse me. Images are crucial to our ability to communicate social knowledge, so this is no surprise really. However, despite the salience and importance of images to these groups, research into their visual content online is comparatively underdeveloped. Research that has been undertaken has shown that the use of images by extreme right groups have been multifaceted and complex. For example, a study of the use of Facebook by German far-right groups identified that posts were both authoritarian, focusing on ideology, and intimate as well, focusing on relationships, both with leader figures and the opposite sex, all within the images. Perhaps most significantly, images are important for study, especially when it comes to the extreme right, due to their subtlety. It's much easier to detect and therefore remove extremist content related to jihadist-type terrorism, as it tends to be much, much more overt in meaning and violence. Far right and extreme right content, especially images, as we'll see shortly when I show you some examples, are much, much more subtle in their approach and meaning, and without the accompanying text and context, don't seem harmful at all. And for us, that made this an incredibly important aspect for our study of Britain First. So this study sought to explore the group's visual communication strategy, specifically their choice of images. And our research questions were co-developed with a number of different stakeholders, and they're there for you on the screen. So firstly, what trends and patterns can be identified within the images? What types of images result in the most user engagement? Are there differences or similarities in terms of user engagement with different image types? And has Britain First's social media strategy changed when we look at the changes in visual strategy from Facebook to Gab? All of this was with the purpose of further understanding the draw of these gateway type groups on social media and seek to grasp their ongoing social media strategy through their use of Gab, which of course they're still using. So in terms of the data that we used for Facebook, the images collected were posted by Britain First from January to April 2017, so the same period as that of the language study. And there were a total of 731 images. For Gab, they were posted May to August 2018. Of course, they began their journey on Gab in that May 2018, and there were 264 images. So altogether, 995 images. We only collected the images that were posted by Britain First on their official pages. We didn't collect any images that were posted to them from elsewhere. And all of these images were copied and saved onto a database ready for coding. So again, this is where my colleague would have spoken a little bit about our methodology here, but basically what we did is a content analysis approach using news values discourse analysis, which involved a systematic coding of image properties, the identification of newsworthiness using Duke's news values framework, and a number of different levels of coding in relation to that. One thing that we did have to be really mindful about in terms of this methodology was that the like function is very different in terms of how it works on Facebook than it is to Gab. So I think we all understand how it works on Facebook. On Gab, it's slightly different. So content on Gab runs on a voting system. Upvoting content is essentially liking it, and downvoting is disliking it. And if you repost content, reposting will share the content with your followers so they can see it as well. And this feature is only available on public accounts. So there were some differences in terms of those platforms, which we needed to be mindful of when we were looking at the data. Now, you might be asking yourself, well, why Gab? Did Britain First not go anywhere else? Well, Gab is a particularly good case study when looking at the move of far right and extreme right organizations from mainstream social media platforms to more fringe sites because of what they champion, really. So for those of you who maybe aren't that familiar with Gab was founded in August 2016, just shy of about 1 million users. It markets itself as a social network that champions free speech, individual liberty, and the free flow of information online. It's not surprising, therefore, I don't think, that Gab is particularly favoured by public figures associated with the far and extreme right, including those like Tommy Robinson. Gab previously stated that it is anti-censorship, we've taken this down now, declaring previously on its homepage that censorship and closed systems are ultimately about two things: destruction and control. The goal of censorship is to silence the storytellers, the truth seekers, the contrarians, the artists, those who question the status quo. In fact, Gab on its homepage used to argue that the internet belongs to the people, that Gab is for the people, and that it's powered by the people. So for me, the use of this platform by Britain First makes for a worthwhile comparison to their use of Facebook in terms of both content posted and level of engagement with the group. As you can imagine, GAB's regulatory practices are in stark contrast to that of Facebook. And just to give you a little bit of an anecdote, if I've got time, during the time of doing this study of the images, myself and one of my PhD students wrote a blog about what we were doing and what it meant that Facebook had been taken, that Britain First had been taken off Facebook and moved to Gab. And my PhD student happened to go on Gab looking for something in relation to our research, and found that the CEO of Gab had actually reposted our blog onto their platform with just one emoji, which was the laughing, crying face. And I think that says a lot about what they felt about our work, number one, but two, also perhaps about how people at the very top of Gab even see their platform and what it's for. And as you can imagine, we had a lot of hate as a result of that within the Gab platform itself. But I tell you that anecdote just to give you a real understanding about Gab for those who aren't as familiar. So what did we do then for this case study on images? Well, we really wanted to understand how the move to encrypted platforms affected Britain First's social media strategy. So let's think about this. Well, on Facebook, as I said, they had 1.8 million followers. Up to December 2020, Britain First's official Gab page had attracted around 11,300 followers, and it's only gone up a couple of hundred since then. The personal Gab accounts of the group's two leaders, which were set up in December 2017, have since then attained around 15,000 to 16,000 followers each. And this is only a fraction, really, of the kind of reach that we saw on Facebook. They are posting much less content per month. In the 4 months we collected data on Facebook, they posted 731 images. In the 4 months we collected data on Gab, they posted 264 images. So we can already see some changes there. In terms of engagement, over the 4 months of data collection, Facebook had a combined number of 3 million likes, comments, and shares, whereas Gab over the 4 months had a combined number of 19,000 upvotes, which you'll remember is very similar, comments and reposts. Although Facebook does have a much bigger overall user base than Gab, and Britain First was much more established on Facebook than Gab at the time of data collection, it does appear that in terms of disruption, just from this quantitative data, 1 year into the Gab page, the rebuild was looking very slow and their reach was still very small in comparison. And I just let you read that quote on the screen there while I blow my nose. So no one moves to Gab because they want to, they move because they have to. So moving on to content, there are two main points that I want to cover. The first is that our analysis showed some differences between the photos posted on Facebook and Gab, and we'll refer to differences in themes soon. In terms of image source and aesthetics, on Facebook, much of the time, the photos don't look like they were taken by Britain First. So the one on the left of your screen there is an example of that. They look like they were taken from elsewhere, and sometimes even like they were taken out of context. And they've added a caption that fits their overall agenda. There's a lot of photos, for example, where text has been laid over the image, or there has been some photoshopping involved. Whereas on Gab, and the one on the right is an example there, it is pretty much aesthetically a case of back to basics. The photos are much simpler. Many of the photos appear to have been taken by the group themselves, and there seems to be much, much less editing. It looks very much like, as you can see here, they've just snapped the picture and uploaded it as it is. As for the thematic categories covered by the images, there were religion, any images that had religious connotations of any kind, politics, which were any images with a political focus, British nationalism, which was any image which depicted anything to do with British people, British culture, or British institutions. And then finally, Britain First, the group, which was all about any images related to the behaviours and membership of the group, as well as the advertising of merchandise. And I'm just going to give you some examples of some of these categories. So these were two taken from the religious/British nationalism category. This one, the politics category, and this is a Facebook example. All of these are Facebook examples. So although groups like ORPHEUS have a lot of the images that we've just looked at, which are negative and focused on others, they also had a lot of images like the ones on your screen now. And we can draw a number of possible reasons for this. Firstly, it draws in people who may not necessarily be exposed to their other content otherwise. You know, many of us would share one or two of these images that you've got there on the screen, not necessarily thinking that there was any negative connotation related to Britain First. They emphasise and push their message of the importance of maintaining British life and culture, and also perhaps creates a positive image of British people, who of course are the in group when we think about Britain First. Once we aligned all our categories, we wanted to see what ones had the most images and engagements. And these pie charts, although I hope they're not too small on your screen there, excuse me, show the total number of images for each of the 4 categories across both platforms. We can see that the category with the largest number of images for Facebook is British nationalism, whereas on Gab it is Britain First, and religion is the second largest category for both platforms. These pie charts show the total number of engagements for each of the 4 categories across the 2 platforms. So for Facebook, that's the sum of the reactions, comments, and shares, and for Gab, the sum of the upvotes, comments, and reposts. The results are the same as the previous slide. For Facebook, British nationalism has the most engagements for Gab, Britain First group, and then religion is the second highest for them both. So we can see some consistency there as well. And the final finding to talk about is the emergence of new subcategories in images on Gab. And these were those that were threatening to dox individuals, paedophile shaming, and anti-LGBTQ+ images. They are therefore more aggressive, more extreme, these images were, than those within the broader parent category on Facebook, and for that reason I'm not going to show them here. And there may be specific reasons for creation of these new subcategories, or their appearance may just be the result of being on a more lenient platform and them thinking, why not, if we can get away with it. But either way, it's an interesting change, and one which we think is worth keeping an eye on. And what I've noticed over the last couple of months is that actually these have become more and more visually extreme and incredibly aggressive and negative in terms of the imagery being shown. So all of what I've discussed so far has some quite key, I think, policy recommendations, and we put these forward in relation, especially to the images study, but I think if we take the 2, they're both very relevant. And a lot of this relates to deplatforming considerations. So we argue that on the basis of these 2 studies, so looking at how prolific Britain First was on Facebook in terms of their engagement, in terms of their usage, but also how their strategy has changed with the move to Gab, that major companies such as Facebook should continue to remove existing extremist groups who violate their policies. And that more governmental effort needs to be put in to incentivize platforms that are unwilling to address extremist content to do so. In this regard, it is vital that future regulatory frameworks are not limited to the major platforms or platforms with a specific number of users, which allow platforms like Gab to slip through the regulatory cracks. Smaller, newer, alternative and fringe platforms need to be held to the same level of responsibility as the major platforms, and they are just as useful to these groups' overarching ecosystem. If we think about how our lives have changed over the last year in terms of our use of social media and technology, with more and more people moving to the online space for both their work and social life, we're going to see the usage of all of these other sites grow and grow. So it cannot just be that we just take these organizations off the mainstream platforms. We need to see a wider draw out of this. We also argue that careful consideration be given within policymaking to the type of content posted online by groups under the umbrella of the radical right, since this content is often non-violent, so isn't picked up by human moderators, let alone computer moderators often. We also argue that any policies or regulations be thoroughly informed by how groups use different platforms. For as this study has shown, strategies of the far right are not necessarily homogeneous across platforms. Blanket content removal for all platforms may therefore be inappropriate. There are a number of situations in which marginalization may be better suited. The first is especially in cases where platforms do not immediately have the resources to hire the hundreds of human moderators that are required for the appeal processes, which are necessary when AI is used for blanket removals of violating content. So for example, just paste it would be an example here. It's just one guy. Number 5, we also argue that ongoing digital literacy programs be created and regularly reviewed that explain how alternative fringe platforms differ from mainstream platforms and their associated risks. This is particularly important, I think, on newer, smaller platforms that are exploited by extremists, yet lack the expertise and resources to know how to respond. A greater focus is, I think, needed on how the findings of these studies can be used to guide and shape future and existing policies across platforms. And finally, a wider array of punitive measures be developed for extreme cases whereby platforms fail to comply with regulatory frameworks, for example, or cases where companies refuse to remove dangerous and exciting content. And I wanted to touch on, at the very end here, societal resilience in this new space. As I mentioned already, over the last few months, our lives have changed. And while many have dedicated their lives to reducing the magnitude of COVID-19 on health, social, economic, and cultural effects on society, others have exploited the pandemic for their own gain. And over the last few months, I've carried out work with a number of different colleagues from Swansea and Sussex University on the change in language of AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland party on Twitter since the outbreak of the pandemic. And there is particular concern with the far right's use of COVID-19 to spread misinformation, disinformation, and conspiracy theories, both about the virus itself and government's response to it, particularly on social media. And through the analysis of a large Twitter data set collected for this exploratory study, what our study so far has shown is that COVID-19 and its related themes of vaccination, lockdown, and restrictions are used to negatively depict officials' handling of the pandemic. And although misinformation, disinformation, and conspiracy theories are without a doubt the underpinning of much of these sentiments, most notably in terms of the far-right group that we looked at here, COVID-19 has been a key frame from which AfD and its followers have communicated their messages and disseminated their propaganda. More specifically, this data shows that COVID-19 has been an effective tool from which groups further polarize out groups and those ineligible to be part of their in-group, to borrow J.M. Burgess' terms. So that would be current governments and that kind of thing. And in terms of takeaways of that work that I've been doing, we might want to consider how COVID-19 has further normalized far-right ideology. AfD originally lost credibility amongst their followers by backing lockdown measures at the beginning. The sentiment that we've seen in the data that we've looked at goes some way to repair that loss in popularity. However, future elections will only be able to tell us how much of an effect that has had. Nevertheless, arguably, all of this lends itself well to widening the recruitment pool pool for AFD and for other far-right organizations, which I would 100% say are doing the same thing, beyond those who would normally engage in their content. So if we think about this in the context of how successful other mainstream groups have been on mainstream sites previously, so Britain First, as we've talked about today, then this sheds into light the importance of trying to build societal resilience in these arenas. This work also highlights the importance of prioritizing research related to societal resilience, which I know the ORPHEUS project has played a big part in. Work that is citizen-led and works to help individuals better manage, monitor, and understand the various online contexts in which they're engaging. I'm going to stop there and welcome any questions. Thank you very much for listening and for your time.
Thank you very much, Lella. That was really, really interesting. And it's really nice to see the links between what you've done and some of the work that we're doing within ORPHEUS as well. I particularly liked your recommendation about digital critical thinking, which we are obviously involved in heavily within ORPHEUS and in general with the clinic. But I also wanted to invite questions from the audience. I know a couple of people have put their questions in the chat, but feel free to raise your hand virtually and we'll unmute you, or you will unmute yourself and ask your question. I have one myself, but I don't want to take chair's privileges so early, so I will let the audience ask a question. I'll start with a question that Sarah De Coster, apologies Sarah if it's De Coster, asked on slide 22. Sarah asks, aren't these Muslims on the pictures shown? I'm not really sure why you wanted to ask this question, Sarah. I think that had something to do, Lella, with you describing how Britain First was trying to portray Muslims as pedophiles, if I'm not mistaken, in that particular slide, and take advantage of something like that.
Sure. Sarah, thank you for the question. Yes, the picture does depict individuals of Islamic faith. But what Britain First were doing at the time was branding all Muslims as a part of these very small case of a grooming gang that just happened to be of a group of Muslims at the time. So it was much bigger than that. And I guess my point at that is that how they were using small stories or presented stories at that time to really influence and push forward with their very racist and anti-Islamic ideology. I hope that answers your question.
Thanks, Lella. Archie also has a question. Perhaps your figures are affected by the social media and search algorithms, not pushing people towards Gab as they do on other platforms?
Thanks, Archie. Yeah, that's a really good point, and one of the ones which I think really affects the kind of figures and upvoting that we see on Gab. Of course, Facebook has a precedent within society, as does Twitter, in a way that these fringe platforms just don't. I mean, I don't know, often when I speak to my students about Gab, none of them are using Gab, which I think tells us a lot about usages of that platform. So of course, search algorithms play a big part in that as well. So that's a really good point. Thank you.
Thanks, Lella. Apologies, I'm told by Annie that we don't have the hand raising function here, so please do unmute if you want and ask a question. Oh, I can see Archie has raised their hand, so must be possible.
Just proving the point that it is possible if you go into reactions.
Thank you, Archie. So Hilde is asking, I hope Lella answered your question, Archie. Hilde is asking, in the beginning of the presentation, you mentioned counter narratives. Are these part of your project, or any advice on this and the difference between counter and alter narratives?
Thank you. That's a really interesting question, and one which is part of the research that we're really looking to develop as we go further. So I'm currently working with some prevent teams here in Swansea on the development of alternative narratives. And the reason that I call them alternative narratives rather than counter narratives, although I may have done that on the slide, is that counter narratives always put us on the back foot. We're replying to something that an extremist organization is saying. Alternative narratives are all about putting the message out there on its own, before or just in isolation to what is being put out there by extremist groups. And I think that that's really important, because what we often see with the UK government, but a lot of governments, is that sort of back foot reaction, reacting to what extremists are saying and not being the ones to put the message out there first. So, as I said, I'm working with prevent teams right now in the hope to work on those alternative narratives. They are incredibly tricky. We have seen some really successful ones in the past, especially in relation to jihadi terrorism. But if you're involved in work in this area, I would be keen to have a discussion.
Yeah, definitely. I think Hilda asked this question because we are also doing some work on alternatives, and we've had these discussions between ourselves, asking how can we move away from this counter narrative process that, as you say, answers to something, and instead find ways of promoting positive role models, positive outlooks, that don't necessarily try to challenge a narrative that is being promoted as well. So we are indeed trying to come up with some stories and some alternatives. For example, one alternative that we are considering at the moment is stories about young people that have joined fact-checking organizations, and their experience about how they decided this was something they wanted to do, what their experiences within those organizations, and how they feel they are contributing to society and so on, which obviously relates to our project and our digital online thinking and critical online thinking, and more generally to the purposes of the project, but does not necessarily try to address a particular narrative in itself. It just offers an interesting, positive story and a positive role model, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's really important and interesting work. And I think to build on that, because what you say is so important, Vas, I think one of the biggest problems and challenges that we have is often when something happens in society, when something big happens, it's these groups that are the first to comment on it. So when everybody is frantically trying to find answers, whether it be about COVID-19 or whether it be about something that's happening in the Middle East or something that's happening closer to home in terms of a news story, we're not getting there first, or the government's not getting there first, or the positive voices are not getting there first. So then we always end up on a back foot, and we need to find a way to mitigate that, I think. And a part of the reason for that is that so many of these groups are so adept at technology and so good on social media compared to their counterparts that it really causes a disparity in terms of the message. So it's really, really important work that you're doing there.
Yeah, and I think it's difficult, as you say, to react first to something that happens when actually you want to find something alternative to talk about rather than this actual conflict that is happening at the time. So that hinders the immediacy of the message a little bit more. And I think it's really important to try and promote positive messages on a regular basis, rather than try to do it on an ad hoc basis when something bad happens and then we need to find a way to respond. But this is a big discussion relating to, obviously, the promotion of positive social causes and supporting charities and stuff like that can support these activities as well. We do have some interesting questions in the chat. So thank you for getting the discussion started. It looks like we have a few very interesting questions. So the next one is from Muslim Busharian, and apologies if I mispronounce any names. I am a victim as well, as you can imagine, so I empathize. Putting in resources from social media companies versus building a bridge between social media companies and the justice system to pursue and prosecute. Does blocking and removal prevent extremism, or just moving it from one platform to another?
Listen, that's a really interesting debate, which I've tackled with on many occasions. I can give you my answer, which is that yes, it does just make them move from one to another, and we can see that with the case study of Britain First. But it does disrupt their engagement. It does disrupt what's happening in terms of their space. So if we think of Britain First, they went from 1.7 million followers to 14,000. So their impact, their reach is much less from that removal. And I think that that's why I advocate not only for these mainstream big social media companies to be removing these groups, but if we had more of the smaller companies being given and given access to the kind of resources needed for the moderation of content, then we might be able to see something much more coherent in terms of removal within this space. We know from the internet, there's the famous phrase, when you take something down, it pops up somewhere else. That is always going to happen. But it's much harder now, for example, when we think about Britain First, for someone to find that kind of ideology. Yes, they still have a website. Yes, they're on Gab. Yes, they're on 4chan, etc., etc. But Charlie down the road isn't going to find that. But Charlie down the road is going to find that on Facebook. And I think that that's why the kind of removal that we see on these mainstream platforms is a really positive thing, but it's only one step in the removal of hateful ideology online. But that's a really big debate, Muslim, and one that I'd be keen to engage in.
Yeah, Muslim, this debate also reminds me of the debate about piracy online, and taking down certain sites that were very popular about, around the late 90s, early zeros. And people arguing, well, there's no point because you can create different sites and piracy will just move on to the other sites. But we've reached a point, I think, in this process where it became a bit too complicated for the mainstream user to actually navigate the new sites or find them or feel confident enough to use them because they weren't as commonly used as before. And that reduced piracy online quite significantly, alongside obviously having very legitimate paid alternatives like Netflix and so on. But it was the same kind of argument, I think, that was similar. And obviously we can find stuff on Facebook much more easily than in Gab, because most of us are on Facebook rather than on Gab, I guess. Another question from Martin de Vele. Again, apologies if I mispronounce. Thanks for the interesting presentation. Have you looked at the proportion of messages that were positive versus negatively loaded? Were the messages mostly negative, or are there also messages with a sense of humor? And were there any signs of dog whistling techniques in the messages?
Thank you, Martin. That's a really interesting point. I don't have the quantitative data in relation to that on me, but what I can say is that it was mostly negative. And one thing that really positions Britain First, but a lot of the other far-right organisations that I've looked at, is that it is all incredibly negative. The government are doing this wrong. The Muslims are doing this. The immigrants are doing this. But there isn't much positive spin on what we should be doing and how Britain First, for example, would make this better. So it's very, very negative in that sense. But about a third of the images, especially that we looked at, were positive about British culture. So we had a lot of that share and like if you like the British countryside, or fish and chips, or share and like if you're against animal cruelty, which I guess is kind of positive as well. We see a lot of that kind of thing. From memory, I don't think we saw much in terms of humor and fun and that kind of thing. But there was definitely a space for positivity. And that tended to be around, those British culture things, definitely around veterans, big message there in terms of that, but also using that to criticize government policies and things like homelessness and that kind of thing. But yeah, I think I'd be safe to say, without getting the numbers out, that Britain First can be categorised by their negative attitude towards everything that's going on in society at that given time. And we've definitely seen that with the work that we've got in relation to AfD as well, who, you know, are a political party within Germany, yet still position themselves within the COVID-19 debate just about what their government is doing wrong, not about what they would do better, which I think is really interesting.
Easier, I guess, to say what's wrong rather than find solutions.
Of course, yeah.
A question from Elias M. Are there some researches or a database where the newer niche social media platforms are bundled to know how the field progresses and moves from place to place?
I'm not sure if I understand your question completely, but if you mean in terms of
is there research or data or a database where you can find, if I'm understanding correctly, you know, any media platforms that the far right is currently using? So is there
I see.
that looks at all the different platforms, for example, that the far right groups are using or something like that?
Sure, thank you. Yeah. Well, I don't know of a particular database that's doing that, but the organisations that are very vocal about what's happening within the social media space are Tech Against Terrorism, and of course the Global Internet Forum for Counterterrorism, GIFCT. And there's a lot of blogs and articles coming out of those in which we're talking about the new social media sites and how they're being used and disused by far right organisations. So they might be a good place to start. And of course, what we're going to have coming soon is Tech Against Terrorism's TCAP, which is the new online database, which is going to hold a lot of extremist data, both on the extreme right side and the jihadist side. And the hope is that that's going to be released in the autumn. And if it is, there'll be an opportunity for academic researchers to apply for access to portions of that data. Which I think would involve a lot of the newer social media sites as well, because that's often where we have a lot of problem, isn't it? You know, collecting data from Gab, collecting data from 4chan, etc. So it might be worth looking at that if you're interested in research in this area. I believe they have a number of seminars next week explaining TCAP. So if you go on the Tech Against Terrorism website, it might be worthwhile for you.
Thanks, Lella. I'm not really sure. Yeah, Leah says yes, I think. So another question from Zakaria Meissner. Thanks a lot for the presentation. Thinking about building resilience in contrast to that, do you have any experience with programs that actively reach out to already radicalized persons or persons that show certain factors of vulnerability?
That's a really interesting question. There's been a lot of research within terrorism studies of formers. So those who have been engaged in terrorism or have started to go down the pathway towards radicalization and then come out of it, whether that be through an exit program or just through their own abilities and their own choices. And a lot of formers have written some really good academic research in this area. Of course, the Prevent strategy works a lot with people that are showing signs of vulnerability and works a lot with those who have come out the other side of extremism and violent extremism. And there's been a lot of work in that area, but off the top of my head, I can't think of a third sector organisation that I would pinpoint. I don't know if you know Vas, but definitely Prevent teams across the country do this kind of thing. Might be worth looking at.
I'm not sure if we have Charlie or John here who might be able to highlight. I can't see all the participants on my screen, but I'm not sure we do. But yeah, they might be able to help because they have worked with Prevent before. So thanks, Lella. From Keely, I took your module on extremism in my undergraduate at Swansea and really enjoyed it. So I'm glad to hear more about your research. My dissertation is partially looking at the effects of Brexit on policing efficacy. The increase in hate crimes following Brexit is a big part of this. Do you think that groups like Britain First use similar tactics on social media in relation to Brexit events to increase anti-immigrant hatred?
Thanks, Keely, and thanks for being here. That's always nice to have ex-students with us. It's a really good question, and I think I did a presentation for the Terrorism Social Media Conference at Swansea yesterday, and someone asked me a similar question, and I think that it's a really important point. We cannot overplay what the far right are doing in relation to COVID-19. Of course, they've exploited the narrative. Of course, they've used it as a way to talk about anti-government, anti-establishment, and all of their relevant ideology and rhetoric. What's different about COVID-19 is the scale in which people will engage with it. You know, it's global, it's affected everybody from people's health to their daily lives, etc. People are constantly searching for answers, especially, you know, this time last year. They did do this with Brexit, they've done it with smaller things. And what I like to refer to this as is presentist stories, you know, small stories which they latch onto in order to then further their ideology and attach it to their propaganda. It just happens to be that COVID-19 is a really, really big story for them. And someone asked me yesterday, you know, do you think that COVID-19 will continue to have an impact on the far right discourse online? And I think it will. I think they'll keep using it to their advantage until we're out of this situation, and it's something that we can remember in history. But I think what's very, very significant is that through COVID-19, in a way that they've never been able to do through Brexit, through anti-immigration, etc., have widened their pool of recruits. And with that, that means that more people are going to be exposed to this kind of ideology. So yeah, I hope that answers your question, but you can always get in touch with me separately, Keely, as well.
I think it's also interesting to say that with Brexit, everyone was still going on with their lives. Yeah. And with COVID, everyone was just stuck inside looking for groups to join and stuff to do and discussions to take part in. And I think that was an ideal opportunity for these groups. As you say, Lella, they are very competent in terms of their online presence and expression. And I think COVID presented this added level of opportunity for them, not just in terms of the conspiracy theories that could be created or reinforced, but in terms of the fact that there were many more people online for much more time. And that gave people, you know, the opportunity. Criminological theory would tell you, you know, added opportunity there. So there's another percentage of crime potentially happening. We do have a few more questions and we do have a little bit of time. So moving on to Toby Baldari. Doesn't it provoke extremists to engage into action if you push them away from mainstream social media? Isn't it better to stay in communication with them instead of marginalizing their opinions? It's not that the phenomenon goes away when you push them away. On the contrary, I'm afraid. Great point, I have to say.
Yeah, very good point. And I take your point. They're never going to go away. It doesn't matter what we do. But does that mean that we don't try and counter the kind of messages they're putting out there? I mean, for me, we need to, one, build societal resilience, allow people to make their own choices, but of course, allow them to understand the kind of misinformation, disinformation on the internet. And there are lots of ways in which Vass and his team are trying to do this as well as others. But I still think that these kind of groups should be removed from mainstream social media. Otherwise, we're not protecting people from hatred. And, you know, if we would think about it within physical space, we wouldn't just let people speak like that within a school or within a hospital or, you know, say hurtful and hateful things towards minorities across society. And I think the age that we're in now, we need to see social media in the same way. So the more we can do to sort of limit the exploitation of social media sites for delegitimizing authority, for delegitimizing what's going on in the world, I think the better, really. But I do take your point. They're not going away and they'll never go away. And that's the conundrum for a terrorism researcher, actually. But I'll leave my answer there to that one.
Okay, thank you, Lella. I think it's a very interesting point whether we let people vent on mainstream media so that they don't take action if we marginalize them. It's a very difficult argument to answer either way, I think. From MS, apologies, I don't know who that is. Thank you for sharing your research and your experience. What are other new platforms of choice for far-right and other extremists in the UK? Do you think deplatforming from more moderate spaces may push some more moderate members further in extremist direction?
Yep, thank you. I'll answer the first part of that question first. Yeah, there's quite a few sites I think that we can pinpoint as being platforms of choice. Gab is one of them, Parler is another, 4chan, 8chan. And there was some really good research that came out recently by J.M. Berger in this area that might be worth looking at. In terms of do I think that deplatforming from more moderate spaces may push some more moderate members further in extremist direction? Research would tell us yes. The study that I've talked to you about today says yes, it will. Because if we look at the visual strategy move from Facebook to Gab, we can see that much of their content did become more extreme. They were engaging in things that they wouldn't have said on Facebook. They just wouldn't have engaged with, from sort of anti-LGBT stuff to anti-police kind of rhetoric and that kind of thing. And not only ideology that they wouldn't speak to and things that they wouldn't say, but it's also the way in which they say it. So this is where the conundrum sort of comes from. Is it better to allow these groups to stay more moderate on a mainstream platform with a hell of a lot of exposure? Or do we remove them from that and they go on smaller platforms where they have less of an audience, but are less censored? And there's a real conundrum there, I think, for us as academics, for the government, but also for tech companies themselves as well. And unfortunately, I don't think there is a simple answer.
There was a discussion like that in Greece a few years ago in relation to Golden Dawn, which was a far-right extremist kind of group. And they were an actual political party that could take part in elections, and they were actually voted in parliament. Because everyone was saying, "Oh, let them expose themselves, let the people see how not very competent they are." But they took advantage of political situations and financial crisis at the time in Greece, and they made it to the parliament. And then, you know, it wasn't just that the language could reach a lot of people through parliament. It was that they managed to get that legitimacy that the parliament offered. So a lot of people that felt such views could not be expressed and could not be acted upon beforehand actually came out and felt that they could now openly be sexist, racist, and so on, which was a very difficult thing for that particular society, which felt it wasn't that racist. And then suddenly you realize 10% of the people have voted, or a bit less than 10% of the people, but have voted for a party of that orientation. So I guess it's a matter of, you know, how far we let these discussions go before they start becoming more legitimized through the constant proliferation in people's conscience. I think that's, for me, the biggest risk.
Yeah, I think I agree. And I think that's why I'm against blanket removal. You know, we can't just say, okay, well, Britain First were, against the policies of Facebook, so let's remove them from everywhere. We need to look at this by case. And I think that's why human moderation is so important. We can't just rely on AI. Otherwise that's too much censorship and we're not allowing people to express their opinions. But as you say, Beth, there must be a line, and that's always been the difficulty when we talk about extremism. You know, when does a viewpoint become extreme? And I don't think we'll be able to answer that today, unfortunately.
Yeah, and as you say, with AI, there's this challenge of over-censoring.
Yeah.
And then the other argument is, if you give platforms that authority to censor whatever they think is problematic, because they're afraid of the repercussions, they will over-censor. So a lot of the groups that are not extremist might be censored, because platforms will be very careful about what they're letting on, with the impact that will have, obviously, on political discourse. So there's a lot of dilemmas in this kind of online harms discussion that is taking place in the UK at the moment, with the new legislation being proposed as well. We have a question about the PowerPoint materials and whether they can be downloaded. I'm not sure we're going to share the slides, but the video is going to be uploaded on both the ORPHEUS platform on the YouTube channel, and Hilde has included the link, and I will talk about our upcoming webinars as well and give you the links in some slides I will share when we finish with the questions, and our clinic Vimeo channel as well. Muslim Busrian again. There are many intolerant trends within minority groups as well that are buried within less used social media platforms and also in the native language of the groups that makes it less detectable. It also contributes to widening the gap between groups. As small as they may be, the collective narrative can be troublesome if overlooked. How do you see the social media companies being able to address this issue?
That's a big question. I guess if we're talking about mainstream social media companies, Facebook, for example, has many different branches and wings to its dangerous organization, policy advisors and officials with it, you know, who hold amongst them many different geographical locations and languages. So I would suspect that you know, much of this would come under that. Yeah, not sure I can answer that question, unfortunately, but it's a good one and something to think about, especially these smaller groups, because they do tend to go unnoticed. It's only when groups tend to be kicking up a big fuss that we tend to notice them, and it's only when they're flagged up to moderation that they're seen as well. So if these kind of smaller groups aren't being detected in that way, then that can be troublesome. I did have to think about how social media companies can address that, but perhaps if you email me or send me a message on Twitter, we can talk a little bit more.
And the interesting thing is these small groups can be affiliated with larger groups.
Yeah.
So even though they fly a little bit under the radar as well, they do take advantage of the influence of the affiliate groups that they are interacting with as well, which is another aspect, I think, that has to do with smaller national kind of groups that relate to the bigger groups.
Yeah.
Charlie, very close. Small Steps are a civil society organization made up by formers that work in this space. I'm not really sure if you're answering to a previous question. If you want to unmute and tell us, if possible.
I think that was in relation to the question about prevent and work in the area of voices of formers and that kind of thing, was it?
Kili says, amazing, thank you. And Alice Bennett says, this has been great, thanks. Nadine Salmon, you talked about the importance of visual content. Have you compared engagement with text content versus visual content?
Nadine, that's an excellent area of research and one I haven't done as of yet. We're looking at the moment, we're collecting new data, which we're hoping to collect both text and visual at the same time over the same time period. And in that sense, we'd be able to do more of that comparative engagement. So it's definitely something that's on my radar because I think it's really important to see. From what I have seen, just looking at the two studies, the engagement with the visual content is much higher than that of the comments and the written text, which kind of goes back to what I said earlier about, you know, we all sort of engage with things online visually more than anything else. So it's no surprise, but it would be really good to see the quants there in relation to that. So thank you. That's a really good suggestion.
Thanks, Lella. And final question, and please don't go after that final question because I need to tell you about our upcoming webinars. But Hilde is asking whether inflicted or felt injustices, inflicted or felt injustices are frequently mentioned as a factor in extremism. Do you address these injustices? Can they be a starting point for opening up the communication again? Or would you advise to ignore them and focus on positive alternatives? Really
good question. I think that those positive alternative narratives should play a part in addressing those kind of concerns. So if we take immigration as an example, you know, we should be putting the positive messages out there about immigration. I recently worked with the Welsh Government in relation to this, you know, looking at, you know, asylum seekers, for example. often these extremist organisations get there first with the kind of things they say about asylum seekers in the UK. And instead, what the Welsh Government have been trying to do is actually send a positive message of how these individuals are integrated into Welsh societies, for example, and what community groups are doing and that kind of thing. So I don't think people's feelings of injustices should be ignored, definitely not. But what I don't think we should do is get into some back and forth debate with the kind of extremist ideology that's espoused by some of these groups, but they definitely need to feature within alternative narratives.
Yeah, I totally agree. I don't think there is they're not mutually exclusive. You can do both at the same time and even combine them. Zakaria Meissner says, thanks again. If time allows, could you maybe elaborate on the role of gender specifics within these movements, or are there maybe resources you could recommend?
Yeah, I mean, my work hasn't really focused on gender, although it's a really, really important aspect of this. The work of Hilary Pilkington might be relevant here. Liz Pearson, Joe Whitaker, they've done a lot of work in this area on sort of gender and the extreme right. So they might be scholars to have a look further for in that area, because it's very important.
Thank you. I don't know if people can see my screen.
Yeah.
Is it full screen now? Annie, can you let me know?
I can only see a really tiny portion of your screen at the moment.
Yeah, likewise as well, Vers.
It was fine until you went into presentation mode.
Yeah, just give me a second. Is that better?
That's better, yeah.
Yeah.
But you can't see a lot of other stuff, probably.
No.
Okay, I'll do it. Give me a second, I'll do it again. Just need to go full screen. Okay. So now you can see full screen, hopefully.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Good.
So a great thank you to Lella, who has braved her cold and Nuria's absence and has given us a very interesting presentation plus 40 minutes worth of Q&A. So thank you, Lella, that was lovely. And great to have you, and your insights from the research were great. We actually got so many questions that didn't manage to ask my question, but I'll ask it individually. So if you enjoyed this, and if you've attended the previous ones, you'll know how nice they all are. We do have some upcoming webinars. So we are going to have the next one at the end of August, 27th, on social gaming, organized by one of our partners in the Netherlands called Do Dat Vern Youth Work. Our second one is on online safe spaces and what works, concepts and methodologies, and is organized by the city of Mechelen on October 14th. And the third one will be organized by another partner, CPIA in Belgium, and it's on Islamic reform movements, Islamism, Salafism, and jihadism. I think I have seen a similar presentation Yusuf has done for us in the project, and it's very, very interesting. Not that the previous ones wouldn't be, but I think if this is related to the one I've seen, it was very exciting, very interesting. The fourth one is Alternatives to Radical Narratives in January, organized by University College Roosevelt in the Netherlands, another partner. And finally, Conspiracy and Conspiracy Theories, I presume, in March 2022 by our French partners, Greta Grappe Littoral in France. I'm guessing they're all going to be recorded online. Hopefully some might be organized face-to-face if COVID allows, but if you want to get in touch about ORPHEUS, here are our social media and our website. So please join us, follow us on LinkedIn and Instagram, have a look at the website. and do get in touch with any partners you feel you would like to discuss something with. We're very keen to discuss our project and other projects that we might get involved in. So thank you all for coming. I hope that has been rewarding and interesting. Another thank you to Dr. Lella Nouri for her contribution today. And hopefully see you at the next webinar, or earlier for the partners tomorrow for some.
Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.